تطلع الخريطة.
دول مخططات قديمة دول قبل الهدم.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kirk Almasian. I have to change settings of the microphone. I hope you're all doing well. On YouTube, those who are watching on YouTube, on Rumble and Ganjin World, and special thanks to our friend Red Access for moderating the live chat. Yes, this video was from Aleppo, the citadel of Aleppo and the surrounding of Aleppo. And let's hope that the Julani regime would preserve these antiquities and all these precious sites in Aleppo and elsewhere in Syria. Because one of the things that the Julani regime hasn't preserved is the sovereignty of the country, and especially when it comes to the Golan Heights. Dude, stop it with the AI thumbnails. It's you, but it's not you. I hope that people would not interfere in what I do on this YouTube channel, whether it is the thumbnail or the content or the beard or the look. Please focus on the content of this stream, because this is going to be a special stream. I have done hours of research, and I find it a little bit disrespectful for someone to come and judge this stream by the thumbnail, because I have done hours-long research to present quality content to you and educational content. And today we're going to dive deep into the history of the region, and especially when it comes to the negotiations between and the talks, whether direct or indirect, between Syria and the occupation country of Israel. And I hope that you appreciate that, because I put lots of efforts in this. I work for many, many hours in order to really present something that we could all learn and understand the context, the geopolitical context, and the historical background of the region, so that we also understand what is going on at the current moment. So I'm going today to walk us through the historical context of Israel-Syria, and we reach to the point where Julani betrays all Syrians and he abandons the Golan Heights and Golan to the Israeli occupation forces. So let me take you back to June 1967. 6 days, that's all it took. 6 days to redraw the map of the Middle East. In less than a week, Israel's army swept across Arab lands, seizing the Sinai from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. For Israel, the Golan was a prize, a natural fortress perched above northern Israel, its ridges commanding every valley below, rich in water, fertile in soil, vital to security. Whoever holds the Golan holds the advantage. Whoever loses it is permanently exposed. For Syria, the Golan was a wound. 40,000 Syrians expelled overnight. Villages emptied. Vineyards uprooted. It wasn't just a piece of territory. It was the part of the Syrian identity. It was part of the Syrian dignity. From 1967 onward, the Golan became Syria's red line. And for half a century, that red line held. Under First Hafez al-Assad, and then under his son, Bashar al-Assad. Through wars, sanctions, assassinations, and isolation, the demand never wavered. No peace with Israel without the Golan. And yet, today, that red line is being raised, not by Israel's tanks, not by America's threats, but by a Syrian who was born in Saudi Arabia, and nobody knows if he is really Syrian, Abu Muhammad al-Julani. Once the jihadist promising to march to Jerusalem, now the ruler preparing to normalize with Tel Aviv. To understand how Syria went from resistance to capitulation, we must retrace this history. From Hafez's iron resolve through Bashar's refusal to blackmail in 2008 to Julani's surrender under the shadow of Gaza's genocide. So let's start with Hafez al-Assad. When Hafez al-Assad seized power in 1970, Syria was broken. The humiliating defeat of 1967 still hung over the country like smoke. The army was disorganized, the economy shattered, and the political class divided. But Assad was not an ordinary politician. He was a soldier who had commanded the Air Force during that very defeat. He had tasted humiliation personally. He had watched as Israel occupied the Golan without resistance, and he swore that such humiliation would not define Syria's future. So his priority was clear: rebuild the Syrian army, restore national pride, and reclaim the Golan Heights. And this brings us to October 1973 war, October War or Yom Kippur War, and this was the big test for Hafez al-Assad. So 6 years later, after the 1967 war, Assad struck back. On October 6, 1973, in coordination with Egypt, Syrian forces launched a surprise assault on the Golan. For the first time since 1967, Israeli defenses cracked. Syrian tanks stormed across the plateau. Entire brigades advanced into territory, though impregnable. Damascus celebrated. The myth of Israeli invincibility was shattered. But victory was short-lived. The United States intervened, launching a massive airlift to resupply Israel. With American weapons and intelligence, Israel counterattacked. Syrian troops were pushed back. At one point, Israeli forces stood 40 kilometers from Damascus. Now they stand 20 kilometers from Damascus, by the way. Still, the war changed the calculus. For Israel, it was a shock. For Assad, it was proof. Israel's occupation was not invincible. Resistance, even if partial, could change the balance. And this leads us to the 1974 Disengagement Agreement. From the war emerged diplomacy. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger shuttled between capitals, hammering out a deal. The result was the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. Israel withdrew from the ruined city of Qunaytira, leaving behind scorched earth. A UN buffer zone was created. It was not the full Golan, but it was a victory of principle. Syria had forced Israel to retreat through pressure, not concession. Assad deliberately left Qunaytira in ruins, a monument to occupation, a reminder of what was lost and what remained to be reclaimed. Now, a rift rises or rose between Anwar al-Sadat and Hafez al-Assad. 6 years later, of 1973 war, Egypt's Anwar al-Sadat made a different choice. In 79, he flew to Jerusalem, shook hands with Menachem Begin, and signed the Camp David Accords. Sadat promised Egyptians prosperity and peace. He received Sinai back. He stripped of real sovereignty, demilitarized, monitored, fragile. Egypt received billions in US aid, but lost its independence over the Sinai. It became Washington's ally. Some would argue and say it revolves under the umbrella of Washington, and Israel's partner. Hafez al-Assad looked at Sadat's bargain and refused. He saw Camp David not as peace, but surrender. He chose isolation over humiliation. He chose dignity over dependency. And that decision defined Syria's path until 2024. From then on, Assad's stance was immovable. We're still talking about Hafez al-Assad. No peace without full withdrawal to the June 4, 1967 lines. This was not just rhetoric, it was the official policy written into every negotiation, every diplomatic contact. The Golan was not negotiable. This was the legacy Hafez passed to his son, and it was the principle that would later collide with America's blackmail, Israel's maneuvers, and Julani's betrayal. By the early 1990s, the Middle East was shifting beneath everyone's feet. The Cold War has ended. The Soviet Union, which was Syria's longtime protector, was gone. The United States reigned supreme. In 1993, Yasser Arafat shook hands with Yitzhak Rabin on the White House lawn. The Oslo Accords promised a Palestinian state but delivered more occupation and more settlements. Jordan soon followed with its own treaty in 1994. Egypt had already normalized with Israel 2 decades earlier. In Washington, the mood was like they were triumphant. One by one, the Arab regimes were falling in line. Only Syria stood apart. For Hafez al-Assad, it was a lonely position. His allies were weak, his economy battered, his military stretched, but he had something none of the others had, a red line, and he wasn't about to cross it. Let's go to Warren Christopher's shuttle diplomacy. The Americans saw Syria during this time as the missing piece of their new Middle East. If Damascus could be brought into the fold, Israel would be secure, and the Arab-Israeli conflict would be declared over. So Bill Clinton sent his Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, on endless shuttle missions. Christopher flew between Jerusalem and Damascus dozens of times, carrying proposals, counter-proposals, questions, and clarifications. And in one of those shuttles, history was made. And this was called the Rabin Deposit. For those who don't know what is the Rabin Deposit, in 1993, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin gave Christopher a private message for Assad. If Syria met Israel's security demands, which means if it agreed to militarize parts of its territory, normalize relations, open embassies, and guarantee Israel's water needs from the Lake of Tiberias, then Israel would withdraw fully from the Golan Heights. Not half, not most, fully. To the June 4, 1967 lines. This became known as the Rabin Deposit. But Rabin demanded secrecy. It wasn't like an official treaty, it was a whisper, a folded note. Clinton himself later admitted he carried in his pocket. For Syria, it was a breakthrough. Israel, at least verbally, had admitted the price of peace. For Israel, it was a tactic, a promise that could always be retracted. So what did Assad respond? Hafez al-Assad back then tested the offer. He asked withdrawal to where exactly? To the June 4 borders, which included access to Lake Tiberias, or not? Christopher returned with Rabin's answer, which was yes, to the 4th of June 1967 borders, including access to Lake Tiberias. But then came the conditions. Israel wanted Syria divided into security zones. The strip closest to the border would be completely demilitarized, leaving Damascus exposed. Israel wanted control over water resources as well in the Golan. So Assad refused. He was willing to discuss guarantees, but not sovereignty carved up into zones. To Assad, a demilitarized Golan was still an occupied Golan. So talks dragged on, progress was made, but the core issue, sovereignty, remained unresolved. Then something huge happened in Israel, and this was 1995. November exactly 1995, everything collapsed because Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. His death didn't just end his life, it ended the fragile momentum of negotiations between Syria and Israel. Shimon Peres succeeded him briefly, but lacked Rabin's authority. By 1996, elections brought none other than Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party to power. Netanyahu, of course, opposed any withdrawal from the Golan, and the Rabin Deposit was buried under the rug. What do we know so far about this issue from Clinton's memoirs? Bill Clinton later recalled those years with a mix of admiration and frustration. He described Assad as tough, deliberate, unwilling to compromise sovereignty. He admitted that the Americans had tried to lure Assad with promise of legitimacy, of Western approval, of breaking his isolation, but Assad never yielded. For him, the Golan was not a bargaining chip, it was non-negotiable. Now, I will tell you a story here, which I heard personally from someone who had sources in Damascus. One of the times when the Americans were discussing with Assad in one of the closed session meetings in Damascus about this issue, and one of the American diplomats asked Assad, why is he being so adamant and stubborn about the issue of the Golan? And he told him, do you see this military guy outside my door who is protecting the palace? He told him, if I give up on the Golan, in Arabic says al-Askari. Askari bab al-bab, the soldier outside the door, he would not allow me to leave the palace. This was something that I learned from a special source, let's say, after the regime fell. So this deposit of Rabin has become a myth. By the late 1990s, the Rabin deposit was half legend, half memory. Israel denied it was binding. Syrians held it up as a proof that even Israel had once admitted the principle of full withdrawal. It was the closest Syria had come to regaining the Golan through diplomacy, and it showed the world the character of Hafez al-Assad. He was a pragmatic but immovable on sovereignty. He could have signed like Anwar Sadat, you know. He could have bought like Arafat, but he refused. So what is Hafez al-Assad's legacy? When Hafez al-Assad died in June 2000, the red line was intact. The Golan was still occupied, but Syria's position was unbroken. No peace without full withdrawal. This was the legacy he passed to his son, Bashar. The world assumed the young doctor would bend, that he would abandon his father's hard line, that he would trade sovereignty for legitimacy, but as history proved, Bashar did not. When Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000, Western capitals saw him a reformer, a London-trained ophthalmologist, a man of the internet age, a soft hand after decades of iron rule. They assumed he would sell what his father would not. They were wrong. Bashar inherited the red line intact, and he carried it into the 2000s through sanctions, isolation, and finally to the brink of a deal in the year 2008. The early 2000s were not easy for Syria, my friends. George W. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, toppling Saddam Hussein and placing US troops on Syria's eastern border. Neoconservatives in Washington openly plotted regime change in Damascus. The Bush administration accused Syria of harboring terrorists, sheltering Hamas, supplying Hezbollah, and undermining America's quote-unquote war on terror. So sanctions rained down, Syria was isolated, and yet Bashar didn't bend. Instead, he doubled down on alliances with Iran and Hezbollah. He kept the Palestinian factions in Damascus. He held the red line, no peace without the Golan. But the pressure was immense, and so back-channel diplomacy began. And here comes the Turkish mediation. By 2007, Turkey was still pretending to play the role of regional mediator. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, not yet fully consumed by his latter authoritarian Islamist nationalist ambitions, wanted prestige, and brokering peace between Syria and Israel would bring it. So Ankara opened the channel through Turkish mediation. Indirect talks began between Bashar al-Assad and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. The question was the same as ever. Would Israel give back the Golan? Now, Washington jumps into this negotiation because nothing in the region happens without Washington's shadow looming. George W. Bush despised Bashar. He didn't want Syria welcomed back into the fold. He wanted it broken. And yet, Bush sent a message to Olmert and threw him to Damascus. He said, quote, "I want Assad to know that the road to Washington passes through Jerusalem." This was the heart of American policy. Not justice, not sovereignty, not dignity, blackmail. If you want legitimacy, you must bow to Israel first. By late 2008, the talks had advanced. Drafts were exchanged, meetings were prepared. Olmert himself admitted later that an agreement was close. But then Israel launched its brutal assault on Gaza. They called it Operation Cast Lead. Over 1,000 Palestinians were killed in just 3 weeks. Turkish mediation collapsed in the flames of Gaza. Still, the records show how close Syria came and why Bashar walked away. Here comes the confession of Ehud Olmert. After leaving office, he gave an interview to RT International. I showed you this in a previous stream. He said, quote, "The greatest mistake Bashar al-Assad made in his life was not making peace with me in December 2008. Had he done so, Syria would not have suffered the civil war. Peace with Israel would have ended hostility, brought embassies, trade relations, and open borders. This would have opened the gateway to Washington and Europe. President George W. Bush told me directly, I want Assad to know that the road to Washington passes through Jerusalem. An agreement with Israel would have changed Syria's situation entirely and prevented the civil war." Here the mask slips, right? Olmert admits what peace meant. Embassies, trade, Western approval, but only if Bashar surrendered his red line. And he admits something even darker, that the war itself against Syria was punishment for refusing to bow to Israel. So Bashar could have signed, right? He could have been hailed as a man of peace, welcomed in Washington, photographed with Western leaders, just like Julani is doing at the current moment, and freed himself from sanctions. But he would have lost Syria's sovereignty. The Golan would not truly return. Hezbollah would have been strangled, Palestine abandoned. So he refused. He chose dignity over blackmail. He kept Syria in what used to be called the resistance axis, or the axis of resistance. And for that refusal, Syria was targeted a few years later. Now, some people may ask and say, would peace have prevented the war on Syria? Now, Ehud Olmert says yes, but let's be clear, my friends. The war on Syria was not because of Israel. It was for Israel. From the moment the US invaded Iraq, Damascus was marked for destabilization. Washington and Tel Aviv could not tolerate a Syria that armed Hezbollah and sheltered Hamas. They wanted it broken. If Bashar had signed with Olmert, would Syria have been spared? Perhaps briefly, but eventually the same forces would have come for him. Only then Syria would have entered the war weaker, already stripped of its alliances and dignity. Refusal in 2008 didn't cause the war. It prevented Syria from entering it already defeated. That would be my answer to many people who are asking me about should Syria have had signed a deal with Israel back then, right? So the cost, my friends, was immense. Isolation, sanctions, and a devastating conflict, but the principle held. And this is why today's events are so shocking to many, because for half a century, Hafez and Bashar refused to surrender the Golan. They endured everything, but kept the red line. Now, under Julani, that line has been completely erased. So Syria moved from resistance to capitulation, and this is Julani's betrayal. Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the man who once led Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, the man who promised his followers that after Assad was toppled, the march would continue to Jerusalem, his propaganda was full of Palestine. He declared that Syria was only the first step, that Al-Quds or Jerusalem was the destination. He invited foreign jihadists from Chechnya, Libya, Tunisia, Afghanistan, tens of thousands, convinced They were coming to liberate Palestine. And today, Julani sits in Damascus, ruler of the state, preparing to normalize with Israel. The road to Jerusalem, it turns out, led him to Tel Aviv. My friends, the facts are clear. According to Arab and Israeli press, and even confirmed in official Syrian outlets under the Julani regime's rule, the Julani regime is preparing a US-sponsored security agreement with Israel. What are the terms of these security agreements? 1. The Golan Heights remains under Israeli occupation, not a word about return. 2. Southern Syria becomes a de facto Israeli security zone. Syria is forbidden from deploying heavy weapons. Israeli jets dominate the skies. Sueda and Mount Hermon are effectively demilitarized. 3. Palestinian factions are dismantled. Leaders of the Islamic Jihad are arrested. The Palestinian Liberation Front General Command expelled. Damascus no longer a sanctuary for them. 4. Hezbollah's lifeline is choked. Where Bashar once supplied Lebanon's armed group, Julani blocks it, policing Syria's border for Israel. And 5. Normalization gestures are flaunted. Shadi Martini, a longtime dialogue advocate, traveled from Damascus directly to the Knesset in July, with Julani calling it a once-in-a-century opportunity. Some may call it an attempt to restore sovereignty. I would call it a subcontracted occupation. Now we come to the Sueda massacres. The depth of betrayal was revealed in Sueda when the massacres happened. In July, the Julani forces launched a brutal campaign against the Druze in Sueda. Julani thought he had Israel's blessing to restore full control, but Tel Aviv had only approved a limited local deployment. When Syrian troops went further, Israeli jets bombed Damascus. And what did Julani's government do? They rushed to clarify. They begged Israel that it was a misunderstanding. Imagine a Syrian state pleading with Israel for permission to move its army inside its territory. If this is not humiliation, I don't know what is it really. So behind this all, Washington pulls the strings. After those strikes, the US pressured Israel to pause and resume negotiations with Julani. On July 24, senior officials from the US, Israel, and Syria met in Paris. Julani's foreign minister, Asad al-Shibani, sat with Israel's strategic affairs minister, Ron Dermer. They discussed stability in southern Syria. And the Syrian state agency, Sana, published that they are talking about restoring peace and stability in the region. This was for the first time the state media outlet publishes and announces it openly for everyone. The very press, of course, this Sana, that once declared solidarity with Palestine, now boasts of meetings with Israeli ministers. Even Sadat, back then, Anwar Sadat, never flaunted his shift, and some would call betrayal, so boldly. But Julani sees common enemies with Israel, right? And here comes Julani's most dangerous statement, that Syria and Israel now share common enemies. I mean, it doesn't, you don't need to be a philosopher or geopolitical analyst to understand who he means. He means Iran and Hezbollah. So pause here. For decades, Hezbollah was Syria's shield. The 2006 war victory was supplied by Syrian routes. Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon kept Israel cautious. Now Julani declares Hezbollah an enemy, aligning Damascus with Tel Aviv against the very movement that once defended Syria. So there is an alliance between Israel and the current regime in Damascus, right? So some here may ask, what about the Palestinians? For half a century, Damascus sheltered them. Arafat, Mish'al, Jihad, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, all had bases in Syria. Yarmouk camp became their home, but Julani is dismantling it all. Islamic Jihad leaders arrested, the PFLP fighters expelled, factions tied to Assad forced out. Damascus is no longer a refuge. it is a warden. What about the UAE's back channel? So UAE is facilitating these talks. This is the same country which already signed the Abraham Accords that toasted normalization with Israel. Julani, who once cursed the Gulf monarchies as corrupt traitors, now depends on them to open the door to Tel Aviv. So the movie of hypocrisy is complete. Damascus, my friends, was once called the beating heart of resistance or Arabism. Under Hafez, it sheltered Palestinian factions. Under Bashar, it armed Hezbollah and hosted Hamas. Today, under Julani, Damascus is being remade into the capital of normalization, a subcontractor for Tel Aviv security. So the transformation is total, not imposed by tanks, not forced by bombs, but signed willingly by the very man who once promised the road to Jerusalem. And all this happens when Gaza is burning. So just look south of Damascus, my friends. Look at Gaza. The strip has become a graveyard, apartment blocks reduced to dust, hospitals bombed, camps leveled, parents clawing through rubble with bare hands to recover the bodies of their children. The numbers no longer shock because they rise too quickly. 10,000, tens of thousands, 20,000 entire family trees erased, right, from the civil registry. This is not war. This is extermination. Some say it is a genocide unfolding before the eyes of the world. And what does Damascus do as Gaza burns? It bows. That's the shameful part. It wasn't always this way, my friends. For decades, Damascus was the second capital of Palestine. When Jordan expelled the PLO in the 1970s, Syria hosted Palestinian fighters. When Hamas was driven from Amman in the 1999, Khaled Mish'al, who is now allies with Turkey and with Qatar, and he celebrated the regime change in Damascus. He lived in Damascus, right? Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, the PLFE General Command all operated from Damascus. Even under sanctions, Bashar allowed them to stay. Yarmouk camp became a political and symbolic center of the Palestinian cause. Damascus once stood as a fortress for Palestine. That Damascus is gone. And of course, Hamas played a major role in this. They have allowed al-Nusra Front to come to the Yarmouk camp and made it a conflict zone, and the entire Yarmouk camp has been destroyed, right? So under Julani, the purge is underway. Leaders of Islamic Jihad have been arrested. The PFLP General Command, which once fought shoulder to shoulder with Syria, has been expelled. Other factions tied to Assad have been forced to leave. No Palestinian sanctuary remains, only prisons and expulsions. And when Israel bombs Gaza, what does the Julani regime now say? Nothing. No free condemnations, no symbolic gestures, no speeches of solidarity. Instead, the state-run outlet runs reports of Syrian ministers meeting Israelis in Paris. They talk of security coordination while children die of starvation in Gaza. So the insult is really staggering. This also brings me into this Islamist hypocrisy, you know. And this is a really cruel irony. For years, the Islamists filled the air with slogans. Millions of martyrs to Jerusalem. The road to al-Aqsa runs through Damascus. Julani himself promised that the fall of Assad would open the paths to liberating Palestine. So what happened now? Gaza is burning. Jerusalem is trembling. The West Bank is completely filled with settlements. So the slogans were lies. Palestine was never their cause, it was their brand to sell their cause, basically, to remove this regime. So what has Syria become nowadays? This is the new Syria under the Julani regime. Weapons convoys to Hezbollah blocked. Palestinian factions expelled or jailed. Troop movements in Sweden dependent on Israeli approval. Solidarity with Gaza replaced with confidence-building measures with Israel. So what does this mean that Gaza burns while Damascus bows. It means Palestinians are abandoned. It means Hezbollah is strangled. It means that the last Arab capital of what used to be a resistance capital is now turned into an accomplice. And it exposes the hypocrisy of the Islamist project in the region. They shouted the loudest about Jerusalem, but when Jerusalem bled, they bowed the fastest. Now let's learn something about the Egyptian lesson. To understand Julani's path, we must look back to Egypt, right? In 1979, Anwar Sadat shocked the Arab world. He flew to Jerusalem, stood at the Knesset, and signed the Camp David Accords under Jimmy Carter's watchful eyes. The promise was simple: peace in exchange for land. Egypt would recover Sinai, Israel would gain recognition, and Washington would open the floodgates of aid. Sadat told the Egyptians back then, no more wars, no more funerals. With peace will come prosperity. The West hailed him as a visionary. Israel rejoiced, but the reality for Egyptians was very different. Yes, Egypt got billions in aid. For decades, over $1 billion a year in US military and economic support flowed into Cairo. But aid is not sovereignty. Aid is dependency, right? With every dollar came conditions: privatize, liberalize, cut subsidies, obey IMF dictates. The Egyptian army became reliant on American spare parts. The Egyptian economy became bound to foreign loans. Instead of independence, Camp David delivered clientelism. Egypt's choices were no longer its own. And what about Sadat's promises of prosperity? 4 decades later, after these Camp David Accords, Egypt is poorer than ever. The wealth gap has widened dramatically. 1/3 of the population lives in poverty. Bread subsidies have been cut. Food rationing has been dismantled. Electricity and fuel prices have soared. The Egyptian pound has collapsed again and again and again. Billions in aid arrived, but they enriched the elites, deepened corruption, and bound the state tighter to foreign creditors. So normalization didn't bring prosperity, it brought more poverty to Egypt. And this was the real trade: sovereignty for legitimacy. Egypt gained embassies, trade, Western approval, but its independence was curtailed. It became very much tied into the American aspirations in the region. Its freedom of action constrained by the deal it had signed. Camp David gave Cairo a seat at the table, but at the cost of speaking only the language of Washington approved. So let's draw some parallels with Syria. Look at Julani's Syria now. The same promises are being made. Normalization will bring Gulf investment. Reconstruction funds will flow. Sanctions will be lifted. Syria will rejoin the international community. It is the exact same script Sadat read in 1979. And just as Camp David bound Egypt, Julani's deal will bind Syria. Just as Egypt's economy was restructured for elites and creditors, Syria's economy will be liberalized, privatized, and sold off to Gulf investors. Ordinary Syrians will not benefit. They will pay the price very, very soon. Egypt today is not a model for Syria. It should be considered a warning. Camp David didn't save Egypt. It didn't deliver prosperity. It delivered dependency, austerity, and diminished sovereignty. Julani is walking the same path. His promises of investment and legitimacy will lead to the same outcome: poverty and betrayal. For decades, my friends, Islamist movements in the Middle East carried the banner of Palestine high, right? They shouted louder than anyone about Jerusalem. They promised liberation. They told the world that millions of martyrs would march to al-Aqsa. It was their ultimate slogan, right? Their recruiting tool, their rallying cry. But slogans are not strategies, and Palestine for them was never truly a cause, it was branding. No figure embodied this more than Abu Muhammad al-Julani. When he emerged as the emir of Jabhat al-Nusra, he declared that the fight against Assad was only the first step. After Damascus, he would go to Jerusalem. His propaganda was full of the Dome of the Rock, of Al-Quds. He invited foreign fighters with the promise that they were not only fighting Assad, but they were on the road to Palestine because, according to them, Assad was a client for Israel. And many believed him. Thousands came to Syria, and they were convinced that their sacrifice was for Al-Aqsa, right? But what did the Julani actually do? He took their blood and used it to seize power. Their death brought him Idlib and leverage with Turkey and eventually the throne of Damascus. And now, instead of marching to Jerusalem, he marches to Tel Aviv through back channels, through security coordinations, through normalization. And by the way, Julani is not an exception. He is the rule. The Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt to Syria has followed the same path. For decades, they denounced the Camp David Accord. They called Sadat a traitor. They invoked Palestine endlessly. But when Mohammed Morsi became president in 2012, what did he do? Did he cancel the Camp David Accord? Did he close the Israeli embassy? No. He reassured Washington that Egypt would honor its treaty with Israel. In Syria, Brotherhood link or Muslim Brotherhood linked factions filled their propaganda with Palestine. But when the war erupted, who did they fight? Not Israel, not the occupation. They fought the Syrian state, they fought Hezbollah, and they fought Iran. The very actors confronting Israel. So this is the bitter truth. The Islamists never fought Israel. They fought Israel's enemies. In Syria, Nusra attacked Hezbollah convoys. They besieged Yarmouk, starving Palestinian refugees. They demonized Iran, parroting Washington and Tel Aviv's language, all while claiming they were on the road to Al-Aqsa. And here lies the contrast, right? Hafez al-Assad never claimed divine legitimacy. Bashar never shouted religious slogans, yet both refused to surrender the Golan. Both armed Hezbollah, both sheltered Palestinian factions. Meanwhile, these Salafist Takfiri Islamists who screamed the loudest about Jerusalem bowed the fastest. Resistance is not measured by slogans, it's measured by sacrifice, by cause, by who holds the line when it is the hardest, right? And by that measure, Julani and the Brotherhood are nothing but frauds. So let us return to the beginning. 1967. Israel seizes the Golan Heights, a plateau turned into a fortress against Syria, a wound carved into the nation's soul. 1973. Hafez al-Assad launches war to reclaim it. He doesn't succeed in regaining the heights, but he proves that resistance is possible, that Israel is not invincible. 1974. Assad secures the return of Quneitra, deliberately left in ruins as a monument to occupation. 1979. Anwar Sadat signs Camp David Accords. Hafez al-Assad refuses. He accepts isolation over humiliation. He chooses dignity over dependency. From then until his death in 2000, Hafez al-Assad held the red line, no peace without the Golan. Bashar inherited that line. He faced American threats, Israeli offers, and international isolation. He was told the road to Washington passes through Jerusalem. He was offered embassies, legitimacy, trade in exchange for surrender, and he refused. And for that refusal, Syria was punished. For that refusal, it was targeted, but the line held. And then came Julani, the man who built his career screaming about Al-Aqsa, the man who told the world that after Assad fell, the march to Jerusalem would begin, the man who invited Takfiris from across the globe under the banner of Palestine. What does he do with power? He abandons the Golan without a fight. He demilitarizes Syria's south under Israeli conditions. He blocks Hezbollah supply routes. He imprisons Palestinian leaders. He declares that Israel and Syria have common enemies, and he sends convoys to the Knesset. This is betrayal. And the timing, the timing of this is crazy. At the very moment Gaza is reduced to rubble, entire families exterminated, children starved, hospitals bombed, Julani goes to Tel Aviv. The contrast is really unbearable, in my opinion. So here we stand, my friends, at crossroads. One path is resistance, sovereignty, dignity, solidarity with Palestine, and the refusal to surrender the Golan. The other path is capitulation, normalization, dependency, betrayal, subcontracted sovereignty. Hafez and Bashar chose resistance. Julani has chosen capitulation. And history doesn't record slogans, it records choices, it records decisions, it records strategies. It will remember, therefore, history as the man who drew the red line. It will remember Bashar as the man who refused blackmail, and it will remember Julani as the man who bowed to Tel Aviv while Gaza was burning. The martyrs of Quneitra, the fighters of 1973, the steadfast of Gaza, the defenders of southern Lebanon, they set a standard for the people in the region, and Julani will remain the standard of betrayal. So, my friends, let us be clear. This is not peace. This is not diplomacy. This is surrender. The Golan is still occupied. Gaza is still under genocide. Palestine still cries out, and Syria's rulers have abandoned them. But resistance cannot die, It lives in the region and it comes back with different names and shapes. So the choice remains. People have the choice between capitulation and resistance, dignity or dependency. And history will judge, not by the slogan shouted, but by the betrayals committed. So when I speak about history, I want to make sure that such videos are made in order to record it as a history, because the victors now, they're trying to write their own history about this region. And they're completely distorting the realities the way they like. That's why I find myself have the responsibility to make such videos in order to try to document history. Because if we leave history for them, then they will rewrite it, they will manipulate it, they will tell whatever they want. And we need to have some responsibility if you are a Syrian, or if you are any person, objective person who cares about the region, because this region is rich of civilization and history, and this is part of the world civilization, right? Global civilization. This is not exclusive for Syria. Then people need to be wary and learn more about the region to understand what is happening. That's why when one of the journalists asked me, why do you do what you do? And I said, I feel responsible about what is going on in the country. And many people do not understand that, because many people saw the conflict in Syria as an opportunity to fill their pockets. Journalists, intellectuals, think tankers, writers, authors, students, they have seen it as an opportunity for prestigious jobs, for scholarships, for job opportunities. But Syria needs its good people. Syria needs genuine people. Syria needs people who are honest and with dignity to tell the people the truth about what happened in the country for 14 years and even before that. And these people should include my teachers and professors who taught me in the university, but many of them turn out to be frauds, turn out to be can be sold out just like any other people. And they would hit the trumpet of the winner. Always. In Arabic, they say, اللي بيتجوز عمي اللي بيتجوز أمي بقول له عمي. So whoever marries my mother, I call him my uncle. That's not that cannot be the criteria for Syrians. Syrians are dignified people, and therefore they need a class of people educating them about these facts. But the facts have been hijacked by billions of dollars worth of propaganda machine against the Syrians, to the extent that the people would go to the streets and celebrate their own demise. Imagine that. So, I would like to thank our friend Sevakjan for gifting a Syriana analysis membership. And I would like to thank our dear friend Red Access for moderating the live chat today, as usual. Today I was reading my research, so I wasn't able to read many of your comments in the live chat, guys, but thank you so much, really. Whether you watch this on YouTube, on Rumble, or Ganjin World, if you like this work, the analysis, the work, the research, the investigation, I would appreciate it if you hit the like button, thumbs up, subscribe to this YouTube channel. That would be amazing. And if you like to do more and you would like to support the independent work I'm doing, you can become a patron. The link is scrolling on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana analysis. Or there are different other means in the description below if you don't like to use Patreon. Tomorrow, I'm going to be with our friend Ihsan Safarnajad. I will record the episode during the noon time, and in the afternoon I will play it as live. So it's not going to be live technically. I will record it with him because in Iran it's very difficult to secure proper internet for live stream. So I will record with him and then I will broadcast it as live with our dear friend, geopolitical analyst Ihsan Safarnajad. It's going to be very interesting talk about lots of things, one of which is Jawad Zarif's new article. He says the time for a paradigm shift is now, and what the reformists are doing to in Iran, and the changes they want and the changes they aspire. So thank you so much, guys, for every one of you. I really appreciate it. So I wish you peace. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.